Welcome to the Iyun Podcast, an in-depth look at chareidi society, Israel, and the Jewish people. I am your host, Ari Koretsky, and I invite you to join us as we confront the challenges, joys, and possibilities of Torah-centered living in an evolving world. The Iyun Podcast. Think again. Welcome back, friends, to another episode of the Iyun Podcast. Many people have been asking me, when will we move on from our mini-series? Although it's hard to even call it a mini-series, though that is what it is meant to be, on the Army. And the answer is now. We will be proceeding to some other topics. Not to say that we're leaving the Army topic in the dust. As much as we've said about it, much remains to be said, and there are actually a couple of episodes and subtopics related to that I'm still working on and would like to see addressed if we can activate the ideal individuals for them. But we are indeed going to explore some other topics, beginning with the role and purpose of media in the chareidi world. Now, at first blush, we take for granted that there is even such a thing as Jewish or chareidi media. But of course, in the long arc of Jewish history, it is a bit of an anomaly. Probably post-Enlightenment, something that emerged once competing influences entered the picture, and Jews needed not only a way to be informed and made aware of what was going on in other parts of Jewish society, but to have entertainment, of course, and even more importantly, popular works that would culturally and intellectually shape the contours of the community and maintain relative allegiance, especially during times of great historical hemorrhaging. In any event, there are a few people who have been more engaged in, invested in, and popularized by chareidi media than Yonasan or Jonathan Rosenblum. Jonathan is someone I've spoken to on my other podcast, Jews You Should Know, and I've known for quite a few years in various capacities. But here we speak to him about his particular expertise as a writer, a longtime columnist, trying to understand the purpose of this medium, whether or not there are any red lines that he negotiates, censorship, and other related themes. So I invite you to enjoy this change of topic and a delightful, perceptive thinker in Jonathan Rosenblum on this episode of the Iyun Podcast. We are here with Jonathan Rosenblum, the esteemed columnist, longtime media personality within the Jewish chareidi world, and has a wealth of experience with respect to the topic that we are diving into today. How are you, Jonathan?
I'm good. It's good to be with you, Ari.
Fantastic.
Okay.
Now,
you should know, by the way, that it's not just within the Jewish world, because I did have a column for 20 years in the Jerusalem Post, and written for a number of non-chareidi, non-religious journals as well. Okay, but anyhow,
beautiful. Well, that was my first question. Was actually going to be, we've done a full length biography, or as close to it, on my other show, Jews You Should Know. But for the purposes of this podcast, let's just establish your journalistic bona fides and go through that brief professional biography with respect to where you've written and what you've been engaged in from a Jewish journalism or general journalism perspective.
Okay, so basically my start in writing altogether came when, after davening one night, Rabbi Aaron Feldman came up to me and said he had just been appointed the editor of a new journal, which would be the English Yeted Neman. I guess this was in 1989, when the Degel Torah party had broken away from Agudat Israel in Israel, and they were putting out a 4-page paper. Anyhow, Rabbi Aaron asked me if I would like to help him. I agreed, and 10 weeks later he left, and I suddenly found myself as a 10-year Baal Tshuva, as the voice of Rav Shach to the English-speaking world, which was, given that I had only been to Bnei Brak once in my life at that point, that was something of a culture shock. But anyhow, through that, I got to know Nissen Walton's the Jewish Observer, and probably became the most frequent contributor to the Jewish Observer from 1991 to its closure. And I also became friendly with Les and Sherman. They were very good friends of one another, and started writing biographies for Art Scroll, which I think we're now up to the 13th book published, and most of them with Art Scroll, and I think there were 6 in that between 1990 and 2000. So that's the start. But I've written for everybody. I've written for, besides Yaftet Ne'eman and going back to Yaftet Ne'eman. In recent years, I wrote for Hamodia for a long period of time. And when the English Mishpacha is now about 20 years old, and I don't think, if I've missed 2 or 3 issues, I don't think I've probably missed even that many. So I've been writing for them every week for the last 20 years. And in addition, I had a 20-year run at the Jerusalem Post. I've written for the Jewish Week, some other journals, but that more or less covers it.
Okay, beautiful. So now I want to dive into the meat of the conversation, and that is the kind of the purpose and boundaries of chareidi media. Now, I don't normally ask long-winded questions, but just let me develop a particular line of inquiry here. My essential question really is whether chareidi media establishes trends and mores or reflects them. I guess it's like the siman or siba in yeshivish parlance. And I want to give a couple of examples. One is an issue of women's pictures or lack thereof in publications. I understand the online, let's say in Mishpacha, has a different policy, but in the print editions, right? Now, I personally am not a great fan of this approach, and we can talk about that. But the question is, is that a choice driven by consumer demand, or to attract a certain segment of the population, or is that designed to establish certain values? Right? Think about another example would be some of the extravagances that are advertised in many of these magazines. Right? This is exceptionally upscale retreats, food displays that our wealthiest ancestors couldn't have begun to imagine. Glatt kosher, Hasidische Shechita, non-gebrachs, but it would seem to be, again, from a very judgmental posture, sort of the textbook novel B'Rishos Torah from the Ramban's perspective. Now, again, is that an endorsement of certain kinds of lifestyles? Is that just a concession to capitalistic realities? What role and responsibility does the media play?
Okay, you raise 2 issues that are really separate and have to be tackled separately. I'm also not a big fan of the ban on women's pictures, and that started with Hamodia. I don't know exactly why Mishpacha went along, especially since most of its senior staff are women, and from my discussions with them, I think it's a policy that doesn't meet with their great approval. And sometimes it leads us into ridiculous situations. Let's say you have a picture of the war room after the killing of Osama bin Laden, and Hillary Clinton is somehow X'd out of there. I don't think, my guess is that it's not a halachic requirement for sure. I think Rav Chaim Kanievsky, Zeichet Tzadik Lebracha, wanted pictures of his Rebbetzin in the biography of Rebbetzin Kanievsky. The Art Scroll always had pictures of women at some stage in their lives. I mean, they were always sneakily dressed women, but the pictures existed. Most of us walk out on the street, there are women on the streets wherever we go. So I don't know I don't really know what's gained by this policy. I think Hamodia was concerned with a certain, maybe a more Hasidic olam, but I just gave a speech a couple of weeks ago, and 2 girls came up to me. They said, "You raised in one of your columns whether you have any Hasidic readers. We're Hasidic, and you have Hasidic readers, so don't worry about it." I don't know. I don't think it's one of our greatest achievements. And the fact that we've now broken that, at least with respect to the online edition, where at least the headshots of the women are available. And sometimes it just makes a story impossible when you can't, when you're focusing or featuring a woman. Let's say I did an interview with Caroline Glick, a very prominent commentator, to not have a picture, or Melanie Phillips, two very prominent political journalists, to not have a picture of them is difficult, to say the least. It just makes the whole thing awkward. So it's not something that really speaks to me. Now, with respect to the advertisements, yes, they are a business. If you want to put out the amount of material and the amount of staff that, let's say, Mishpacha employs, important, Rabbi Volpin in his time put out the Jewish Observer single-handedly, and didn't know how to use a computer. I mean, it's almost unbelievable when you think about the contrast between then and now, and this is in a very short space of time. How we jumped to really glossy publications with an incredible amount of material in them, and the Pesach and Sukkot issues, an incredible amount of material. I know people who say that they won't bring the Mishpacha into their home because of all the glossy advertisements. I don't think that Mishpacha is the primary driver. Those advertisements are a primary driver of materialism in the community, and they won't stop Doug Haller, Shmuley Besser from writing a serial which is very, it's somehow pokes fun at the nouveau riche in Lakewood. They won't stop that. They'll have that serial. The Kichels can poke fun at a lot of these things, and I'll tell you the truth. I think it's important when you grow up to know there's always somebody richer, smarter, prettier than you are, and live with it. That's not going to. That doesn't define you. Some of us find this out later in life than others, but I think they can be used as a teaching device for our children too, about what does Ibn Ezra mean when he says the Kafri doesn't think he's going to marry the daughter of the king. So a lot of the things, they're not shaykh to most of us. I skip them over. It just makes it harder for me to find the table of contents. I don't really look at the advertisements at all. I think it's not. It's just. There is a lot of keeping. I suppose there's some keeping up with the Schwartzes in the film world. It's less true in Israel, for one thing. So I think it's less true in Israel, which is still a less materialistic society. And no one's going to talk about matching all your girls in the same robe for Shabbos. They should have the same Shabbos robe or something like that. But I think most people know they can also be used as a teaching device. And let's face it, they are businesses. These advertisements allow them to employ large staffs to put out, I think, a very high quality product. And I don't have a big problem with it. I think it is important for us. It is important for us to learn that just because somebody else has something, we don't have to have it. Maybe these advertisements are even a help in teaching our children that. Okay.
So what is the purpose then of chareidi media? Again, if it's not necessarily to establish values or to propagate values, at least parts of the content are allowed to contradict certain values. So is the goal informational? Is there an educational role? Is it some sort of like a socializing impact, create a sense of community, the cultural kind of influence? What would you consider to be the goal of these publications, as opposed to just go online and get your news from, pick your, hopefully, relatively accurate or clean news site? And there are some nowadays in today's world, even if many of the legacy media outlets are, have failed in that duty. So what is the point of having it kind of an in-house media?
Well, I do think one of those things is to make it possible to get most of your news from in a religious site, where you're not going to have all the problems that you might have either going online or might. That's one thing, and I think that's an important. It's always been true of film media, and it also focuses on different issues. I mean, obviously, the political commentary and mishpacha does have one columnist who knows something about the goings on in the Knesset and so forth. That wouldn't be something that you'd find in the general media. So you can find out something about the community in which you live and the political stances that are being taken and things like that. It also builds up a tremendous sense of being part of a larger Jewish world. I mean, this is, as I said, when I've been in South Africa, for instance, or in Europe, they just don't, they're isolated in many respects from a larger Jewish world. Between the United States and Israel, people travel back and forth fairly frequently. People come here to learn in shivas. But somebody raising their kids in South Africa needs to know about a broader Jewish world. And we also need to know about the South African community. As when Rabbi Warren Goldstein has become, one of a world Jewish leader, not just a local figure, but a world leader in Orthodoxy. So we have to know about that as well. And I've written, a number of features about the Indaba there and about what's going on in that community. So that's also another function, is to create a sense of community. A lot of it's inspirational. I mean, and some, look at the quality of columnists. I'm not such a big consumer of chareidi media, even though
you're a producer.
It's around the house. My wife definitely reads more of it than I do. But if there's a Rav Ruben Leuchter, there's a Rav Aaron Lopiansky who are putting columns in there, and they're not only one, but at least as two examples of people at a really high level who make you think about different things. The ability to highlight things for our community. I've been treated very well by the chareidi media, in the sense that I can read anything I want. It's just been great for me. I mean, I'm just thinking of the books that are by my desk. Jonathan Haidt's the Anxious Generation,
yeah,
and so forth. Conservatism or Rediscovery with Yoram Chazoni. These are books that, being a columnist for Mishpacha, allows me to read, allows me to think about interviewing them, allows me to think about ways in which to bring to the attention of hate, at least a community that really appreciated a lot of the dangers before anybody else did, who picked up on these things early and has tried to circumscribe them much more than probably any other community with which he might be familiar. And these are great opportunities for me to talk to leading thinkers. One that I'm never going to get to, I suspect, is Abigail Schreier, who's written a book on the
transgenderism. Yeah.
Now, if I ever write on transgenderism, it will probably be for Rav Aaron Feldman's journal, Dialogue. It will not be, there are restrictions. It's a family magazine. I'm not going to be able to write about that. I'm writing an article right now on family formation and J.D. Vance's comment about cat women.
Cat women.
Yeah, and I did make a mention of an article that I had read where she talks about a group of friends who all decided to go out and get divorced and see if they could pick up younger boyfriends and so forth. I think part of that is, I'll write it a different way because I'm writing for Mishpacha. But
I can tell you're a free press reader, at least.
Yeah, that's right. Exactly right. Oh, Cat Rosenthal, you read it too. Okay. Well, there are two things that everybody really has to read, and I'm delighted that between Tablet Magazine and the Free Press, you are really exposed to a lot of high quality journalism. It's interesting that
I would add commentary to that.
Yeah, but it's old, a little stultified. They put out more material for one thing. They get younger columnists. Okay, I also subscribe to commentary, and I've subscribed to.
I know you listen to the podcast because you reference it sometimes.
Yeah, less to the podcast. I'm a reader more than I am a listener. Listening takes too long. When people tell me that they read, that they do audio books, I can't believe they.
You gotta just get double. You gotta just discover double speed.
Yeah. Okay. Right. Okay. So, anyhow, what's the next question?
So again, you've said that the point of chareidi media is to gather, sort of like an aggregator of news, or even focusing on particular stories, niche stories that wouldn't otherwise be covered, and to give people kind of a sanitized environment in which to consume those stories. And then number two, it's inspirational. It allows for religious education and religious inspiration from great rabbinic figures you've mentioned, and I guess there's some others that are up and comers, and Rabbi Sklar has been in there, a friend of mine, a number of times recently, and kind of the next generation of thinkers.
I think he has a monthly column now.
Right.
And you are looking, and you do find people. I think he has a monthly column. I forget, another Rav is even better known on the Torah Anytime as a regular monthly column. So they're looking, they're always looking, they're always updating. But, and don't forget, I think it does raise issues too. You just have to know where to look for issues that are raised. The fiction, when Dov Haller's not writing, I generally don't follow a serial, even though I like fiction, but I usually read the Pesach and Sukkot calligraphy. I like to read, I do read the fiction, and fiction raises a lot of issues. Not every issue that's raised has to be like the one, are we sending our kids to the army? There are a lot of other issues about how we live our lives, and I think they give a very broad cross-section of things that are really important. Vaping just came up as a big issue in Mishpacha, and it was interesting that they really allowed readers to tee off on
Professor.
They had 11 letters criticizing his diminishing the point of writing a lot of articles scaring people about vaping.
Is Barditchever of the Bachram stance.
Okay, well, that was a good line. That was yeah. Okay. Sruby used to tease me. He said, Jonathan, we learned two things from every one of your articles, that you went to Yale Law School and that you go to the gym. So I said, Sruby, we learned from your articles that that you weren't the Spitzbacher until Yossi Elephant got his hands on you. But it's not, we don't, there's all kinds of things. We all have our little shticks, don't Anyhow.
It's interesting. You see that fiction, I guess, it allows authors to surface issues that would otherwise not be accessible in the nonfiction sections.
Yeah, I think that is true. There are a lot of ways, you learn to write within limits. You learn to raise issues. If you have an issue that's burning with you, I had one time when we had an old censor of the newspaper, he once said on Purim that my function here is to make sure that Jonathan Rosenblum doesn't get us closed down. But that hasn't happened to me in a long time. There's a lot of, we don't all think the same. We don't all write the same. The issue of Donald Trump is an issue upon which you can find a wide diversity amongst the columnists in Mishpacha. And these are things that should be discussed, and and drawn upon. And I think it's nice that people don't feel that they're left out. In other words, the fact that I could spend 3 days listening to a bunch of speeches by J.D. Vance makes a difference, because then a lot of people thank me. Okay, now I know something about it. Now you don't know everything, because, it's good to have columnists who can change their minds, who learn more, who get other perspectives and so forth. And we all do. We try to. I mean, look, let's face it, we're very bad. We're very bad at predicting other people or thinking we know everything. Nobody would have ever guessed that John Fetterman would become the greatest defender of Israel in the Democratic Party. And I'm frankly a little bit surprised. The first time I saw Candace Owens, I thought, okay, here's an intelligent woman, articulate, quick on her feet, making good points. And she turns out to be a crazy anti-Semite, a Looney Tune. So we don't, one has to keep an open mind, and the perspectives will change, and learn that, not every Tucker Carlson, just because he's sometimes effective, but he is also subject to many, many anti-Semitic tropes, and that are really almost indefensible.
Isolationist and protectionist, and become kind of like a populist handmaiden.
Yeah, but it's not just that. It's like taking on a Christian a Christian preacher from Bethlehem to attack Israel, and how are Christians treated in Israel when it's the only country in the world in which in the Middle East, in which the Christian population is growing, and in which they've been completely, disenfranchised and have basically fled from Bethlehem. So there's a lot of, you don't have to look too far to find out one of the problems, but it's it's good to be able to call attention to that to readers who might be a little bit naive. Anyhow.
Yeah, no, I wonder if you get pushback, and you mentioned previously other columnists you've mentioned to me before who took harsh stances on figures that been popular in the Orthodox community. Sometimes, I breathe a sigh of relief when you're willing to call out kind of the valorization of people who don't exactly embody Torah values, but somehow have become kind of like, these epochal characters from communities, kind of objects of worship, which is kind of bizarre to me. And I think that chareidi media, when it's done well, can have a corrective impact in that regard, to kind of, restrain people and kind of gives them a little perspective on those exact situations.
Well, speaking of that, I do think because I'm about Shuva, which makes a difference, which means I always I process information through 2 ears. But I also write for a wider, I consider myself, I don't like to write down to anybody. In terms of the sophistication, word choice, anything, argumentation, I treat the readers of Mishpacha as a high quality readership. And I've never been disappointed in that, really never disappointed in that. But I'm also writing, if your colleague, Rabbi Fox at the University of Pennsylvania, tells me, well, your columns are what I use to show the students to give a sophisticated view, to show that the chareidi world can have a sophisticated view of a lot of issues, then I take that, then that becomes something that I want, that becomes something that's important to me. And is that we're reaching the ability that somebody can take your pieces and go with them. I mean, that's my whole new book on ordinary greatness is really a collection of 30 years of pieces in the written in Jewish Observer. Some were written in the Jerusalem Post, but most were written in the Jewish Observer or Mishpacha or Hamadiyah. They were written in Frum journals. But the whole idea of the collection as a whole was that it would be and the reason I used Jonathan instead of Yonason as the author is that this should be something that somebody could take and give to a non-Frum Jew. And it said, if there's no politics and no theology in it, this is give you some sense of what this community is, what might be attractive to why we're drawn to this. What are the kinds of people who are produced in this community? And, that's in some respects, I consider it maybe my most important book. It's easier for them to sit down with that, which has a long philosophy, than to read through Rabbi Yaakov. In Rabbi Yaakov, my father told me at the time it came out, he said, well, it was like reading one of Dostoevsky's novels. You have to, but it takes 100 pages to get all the names straight, and so forth. But but he did actually say, well, now I understand a lot more about what drew you to this world as well. So that's the nicest compliment I ever got. Anyhow,
I want to ask about the notion of censorship in chareidi media, again, in the different publications you've been in. What are the different policies as to how, I guess, values are communicated from on high, so to speak? Is material censored? Is there a soft censorship? This kind of an internal, an internal compass that this will fly. You mentioned, you wouldn't write on transgenderism. How do you know what you would write about? Does it ever get, kind of looked through, picked apart, or rejected? How are those, whether it's general topics or the specific angle on a topic, how is that handled from an editorial perspective?
Well, I don't know about all the publications. I suspect they all have some kind of censor. We have a censor, Rabbi Newberger, in Muncie, and before that, Daniel Neustadt. And then before that, in the Hebrew, which I wrote for before I wrote before the English, was a Menachem Cohen from Panovich. And all the papers have some kind of censorship. And of Cohen, when I was writing for the Hebrew, which was probably more sensitive, would say, I can't, I have 80 people working for this paper. I can't get us closed down. You're not going to get closed down because you want to express an opinion about the model of long-time learning for everybody. But there's basically two sensitive issues. One, the Army is a sensitive issue.
Yep.
And I had written a piece, I guess probably 2 months into the current war, in which I said just two things. One is the old line that they don't need us in the Army is a little hard to sustain today because we're fighting we have enemies on 7 fronts, and we're doing 2 wars at the same time. That itself is not sustainable. And I also made the point that chareidi political power is not going to save us. There was a time when there was a big division on the peace process between right and left, and therefore, when the chareidi parties held a balance of power, they wielded a great deal of power. There's a general consensus on issues of a Palestinian state and so forth. In that sense, in that consensus, the chareidi parties have less power. They can say that they're going to go elsewhere. Where are they going to go? Where are you going to go? It's like when people say here, well, if they draft us into the Army, we'll leave the country. Yeah, really? Who wants you? I mean, if you have an American citizenship, that's one thing. Okay, that's true. But if you think European countries are just waiting to open their doors to increase their chareidi population, and I don't think Europe is a very attractive destination for most of us because they've opened their doors and there are plenty of Muslims running around who mean us no good. So, and that wasn't the right time because it was an issue before the Supreme Court and it didn't get published, but I wasn't told don't publish it. I was told not now. This is not the time. I don't feel terribly constrained. That's the truth. I don't feel. I mean, I know there were probably periods when it did more, but I have a tendency. My wife says, very selective in idealizing memory. You tend to forget everything that's unpleasant. If you ask me what was left out of this book or that book, I can't tell you. I don't remember, and I'm sure that there were cuts that were painful at a time, and I just did. But you get better at this if you've been I've been doing this since 1989, so you learn how to make your points in ways that are, if you have a point which you think may be somewhat controversial, you learn how to make that. And only wait for Nathan Slifkin to help you in his column or something like that, which will happen from time to time. Uh, but I don't feel it's a.
But I want to double click on the army issue for a second, especially because on this podcast we've done a very, very long series about chareidi and army service and really tackling that in tremendous depth. It's something, of course, that the Eon founder, Rabbi Haffer, is dedicated a tremendous amount of ink and voice to. It is interesting that, yes, it's a sensitive issue, of course, but I'm a pretty avid and comprehensive reader of Mishpacha, and again, I'm only picking on that because you write for them and because I read it the most, so I'm most familiar, and it's probably considered the most liberal or open-minded of the chareidi publications. I can't recall a single pro-army perspective, being aired. In other words, single argument being advanced as to the merits of army service or the opportunity cost of not serving, or the really challenging the status quo. There have been quite a few columns very stridently, deriding the concept, and for various reasons. And, I've had some pretty strong reactions to those, but isn't that an indictment on some level? And again, I'm not asking you to speak about the specific publication, although effectively that is what's happening, but I really mean it more conceptually as opposed to an individual publication. Isn't it an indictment when we can't surface true, authentic perspectives that have real sourcing in halacha and hashkafa, and are held by many erlich, serious b'nai Torah, even if not chareidi per se? Why is that such a third rail? Why can't a topic like that really be debated in a serious way, as opposed to sort of a party line that is just, understood and presumed?
Well, this there was a big issue devoted to the army about, I don't know,
2013, yeah.
And and Aaron Lobansky, nothing that Rabbi Aaron Lobansky writes is not sophisticated or have something to do with it. There are issues, that, let's say, at the end of the day, we are a community that follows rabbinical leadership. Okay, so am I a Talmid Chacham? I'm not a Talmid Chacham. Have I been appointed as the arbiter? I mean, I have frequently been asked, at a wedding or something, somebody will come up to me and say, "Oh, you're Jonas and Rosenblum. What gives you the right to express your opinions on these things?" And the truth is, I sometimes you want to put things in perspective. You might argue, and I have, that every community follows a pendular motion, that issues that there's always a readjustment. Nothing's perfect. I mean, I think I once referred to the idea of long-term learning forever was something that the Chazon Ish said we would need 40 years, but it wasn't too generational. And that and it also has its costs, like chemotherapy. You need it to save the patient, but then there becomes a point where the side effects are great. I don't think I'd write that column every year or every third year, or but the question would be, mi samcha, who gave you, who told you on issues that are of general communal concern that involve the entirety of the community? We are not a democracy. There have been attempts, and I've been participating in some of those attempts to broaden the discussion on a lot of policy issues. I mean, Cloud Perspectives was one such example, with Howard from the
Moshe Bain and Rabbi Adlerstein, Rabbi Howard, sure.
Rabbi Adlerstein, Rabbi Lopansky, and myself. And I think it was pretty successful. I mean, I'm disappointed that we didn't manage to sustain it for longer, and we did have a much broader cross section of people who did write for it. It would be a commercial venture, and there is a place for a broader discussion, but you can't. There are limitations too. I mean, it's nice if you have if you have the financial support of the Tikva Fund, for instance, you can do things that somebody writing for Mishpachah can't. If you just want to put up your opinions at cross currents, so people will comment, people will say yes, people will say no, but you're not running a commercial enterprise. You're not limited, and you don't pretend to be speaking for anybody other than yourself. But when you have a column in Mishpachah, it's understood that this is meant to be a part of the chareidi social structure, which does have a leadership and on issues of general concern, the structure of the education and so forth. You're not really a man d'omer. And you know what? I really shouldn't be, because there's a lot of things I don't know. I'm a newcomer. I don't speak Yiddish. I never went up through the system, as my kids themselves say. Well, Abish, you didn't grow up in yeshiva, so what do you want? I don't should think my kids think I should be talking about a lot of issues. So, they're 40s today, and some of them are up to 40 today. But you also have to know your place. I mean, there are a lot of know-it-alls. I don't want to be one. I don't want to be one of those as well. There are forums for this discussion. This discussion does take place.
I just want to interject, because we talked about knowing your place. I understand that, and we've actually, as we're recording this, our most recent episode was one I did with Rabbi Pfeffer about the whole concept of Das Torah, and really understanding it within the specific contours of this army question, and because that's often these conversations recourse to arguments from authority. At the end of the day, it's like, I don't have a compelling argument myself. People will acknowledge, not everyone, but some people say, but this is what what kind of is the policy. And so that is what it is. But it feels like a bit of a cop-out, in the sense that can't one surface questions? Can't one raise at least what the significant, challenges? Are we so, is it so, we live in, is the answers so shrouded in some kind of a black box that we can't, you're constantly, your columns are constantly raising thought-provoking questions, questioning certain orthodoxies. And, I just wondering, when it comes to certain issues, why the same can't be done. Not to say this should be the policy, but hey, isn't it an issue that, shouldn't we feel a moral concern that that people are dying at a tremendous rate in the Dati world? Is it difficult that, why is it that people can learn for 4 or 5 years in the Dati world and then go to the army, the really stark, Dati Chazak people, and the Haredi world can't, just answering, people aren't aware of these things, raising those questions, right? And
Okay.
That's a self-critical posture.
Okay, so first of all, I have written a lot of columns about soldiers in the Dati in New York, about the Torah that they have learned, that they're learning under circumstances. Yeah, I'm sure you saw that
Sure.
tape from Asher Weiss talking about
Of course.
grandson of my kid's dermatologist, who lost both his legs and an arm, and was concerned about.
But what's fascinating, I think that's actually a really, really interesting kind of Rorschach test, that moment, because in the Haredi world, that's lauded as, look how open-minded Rav Usher is, really appreciating. And in the Dati Leumi world, they're saying, we don't want your empathy, we want your participation. And why are you participating? And that exact, a column about that exact point would be fascinating, right?
So get Rav Asher tonight, who is unquestionably a huge Talmud Chacham. Sometimes things are not advanced by talking about them publicly. If let's say somebody calls up from Jewish JCT, which has a base midrash, it provides a lot of training for a lot of. It's also open to Haredi. There may be
Machon Lev, you're talking about.
In Machon Lev, they may be creating a Haredi Hesder framework. There is such a framework.
Rabbi Grove, we've interviewed Rabbi Carmi Gross, sure.
Okay, so that sometimes bringing these things up only makes it more difficult for changes that are taking place to take place. Not public publicity is not always the best way to further changes in the community, and which I would style as alternatives, because there are changes in the community. There are a lot of people. I have a son who's 30 years old. He's in law school already, but he was a Chevron buffer, and he said that there are a lot of people in the chareidi world who they don't want to not be a chareidi, but they also want to be part of Israeli society. Army service is part of being part of Israeli society. We have a lot of problems today. I don't know if you've mentioned this, and this is not being able to be worked out by politicians and even rabbinical leaders, because the Attorney General has seized so much power for herself, and is, as Rabbi Landau wrote a couple weeks ago, he said we could reach agreements with the army, but then the Attorney General, what's the point of negotiating with the army when the Attorney General will come along and say that they're not okay, or the Supreme Court will come along and say they're not okay. There's no point in having these discussions. They become a waste of time when there's always another level that you have to please. Even today, the Attorney General made some kind of statement about just drafting chareidi young men who are not learning full time is not satisfactory. You have to take them out of learning, the ones who are in full time learning, and the idea that you can create programs at a later stage. There was a program for older married chareidim to work in the army. It filled a couple needs. They got a training, computer training. There are a lot of initiatives. Some have not gone well. It's such a big issue, but I'm not sure that everything is solved by drawing attention to it. The attention would get a lot of play, but I don't know how those things. I'm not sure that's necessarily a good thing. I always tell people when I'm speaking about the chareidi community, don't deduce what's going on in the chareidi community by just reading the front page letters in Yated Naaman. There's a lot of things that are going on underneath. You have to know, for instance, that the Hasidic world is much different than the Lithuanian world. The Hasidic world, each Rebbe is an authority unto himself. He doesn't have to worry. Vishnitz doesn't have to worry about what Belz is doing. Belz doesn't have to worry about what Ger is doing. And each one of them, they can decide that they're going to create a system which is going to take government financing, which is going to have some form of the general curriculum, the chareidi mamlechti. And no one's going to challenge the Belzer Rebbe within his own community. It's a big enough community to support its own school system. So there are a lot of nuances that they're not really, I don't know if they're really the subject of, or should be the subject of mishpacha. But I think there is a sense of modesty on it. There is a legitimate modesty. No one asked me to be the authority on these issues. I don't understand them. I don't have the history that others may bring, and we do have those that we look to for as authority figures. I'm glad that there's a Yeshua Pfeffer, and I'm glad that Rabbi Yeshua Pfeffer is also Talmid Chacham, and I'm grateful for Tzarek Ian as well. I'm grateful for all the places where issues are broached, but I don't think that's not.
So in other words, you would distinguish between, I guess, what you're calling popular media and more niche, or I don't know, more kind of journalistic, the journals and the thought, the places of thought exchange that are generally exist more online. And you would say that there is a place for those conversations, but not in a popular journalistic setting.
Yeah, well, I'm not a big one for censoring other people. I don't like it myself, and I don't like it other people.
Right, but you're acknowledging there's a degree of censorship and even self-censorship, right, within the popular media.
Yeah, you develop a sense when you're not going to be able to write about something. Even writing about Schissel was a controversy at one point because what happened? One columnist wrote attacking Schissel, and I wrote a column saying, "Well, have you ever watched it? I mean, do you know what you're talking about before you start criticizing?" Okay, this happened a long time ago, and I decided that he wasn't happy with my responding to him, so that my column didn't get printed. Okay, you live, you go on, and that's how it is. But I sometimes don't. Sometimes my antenna are not perfect. Sometimes they're better than others. And I think, a lot of people, discussions don't, it's not like the community doesn't have discussions. It does have discussions. People do have different opinions, I'm sure. We're not such a group of, monolithic people with no, I think we probably have as much debate as there is in the elite universities. But you're right. The media, I mean, every magazine has its limitations. I mean, the National Review and New Republic, the New Republic, another nation, are not going to be, they're not going to resemble each other. Not everybody at National Review, not every person who writes there is going to agree with everybody else. And I like it when there are debates. I think debates are good. And I think Mishpacha has done a pretty good job of encouraging debates on a lot of subjects. When they find that there's a wide diversity of leadership, they like to go for that. I mean, there is a style of columns which just gives you two views of a particular issue. They're usually more interpersonal issues, but there are a number of cases. I mean, I think this vaping was one. I think the responses to Smeary Besser's column and so forth, they're not adverse to debate. And I've written many times. I mean, I was a high school debater, a college debater, a report champion. I mean, I like debate. It's
just that certain particular topics don't seem to warrant or allow for it.
I think that's probably right. You didn't need me to tell you that. You knew that coming in. Right. But I still think, I think it's been a tremendous gift to me personally. It's what I've been able to learn about, the people I've been able to meet, the books that I've been able to bring to a public. I'm going to write a feature in the coming weeks about Michael Kaufman, who's written a book on health, to show that this is a real serious issue too, health. And he's a guy who's 93 years old today who goes around Mea Shearim on every Arab Shabbos and will grab people who are smoking and tell them, how many of this serum do you think you're over now? And so forth. I feel that I've been blessed to come into the community late, to start writing only close to 40 years old, and to have been able to have the amount of impact and influence that I have. I feel I've been really blessed, and I do think there are other ways. No one's looking to me to solve the issue of arming. But there were a lot of columns which highlighted the Torah learning and the bravery and the serious nefesh of the Hillsdale people. That they will not stop. They will not censor them. I think that was they're little. You make your impact in different ways, and just to express your admiration to people who are obviously doing something that's great. And showing a courage, which as one who's never been under fire, I can, I have to admire just have to be filled with that. I don't think it's anything embarrassing to say that you do admire and those who make a scene under fire and in bunkers and so forth. It's very impressive. No question.
Now, just in closing, tell us a little bit about your new book. You alluded to it before. It's kind of a compilation of columns over decades, actually. What is this new book? Is it different, really, than others you've written for, and what's special about this particular new volume?
Well, it's ordinary greatness. It's first of all, it's my most personal book. There is a long autobiographical section. I mean, some of those are columns. I'm turning 50, I'm turning 60, I'm turning 70, and Yitzhak Hashem comes back and give me the power to write when I turn 80 as well. But
write it ahead of time, just in case, you know.
In case I don't make it, what I would have
Been.
Yeah. Anyhow, I'm and it was a chance to write about my father, my mother, and my brothers. I could set up the bracha to, but I just think it's so important to understand the amount of greatness that there is around us. So there are all kinds of different things in there. There's even a few non-Jews, a piece on Margaret Thatcher, and a piece on George Washington, on a book that a good friend of mine gave me on George Washington, a piece on Abraham Lincoln, and some interviews. And those interviews are really, they're part of what makes writing for Mishpachah so meaningful to Yehuda Avner on the prime ministers, and Robert Wistrich, who was the greatest scholar of anti-Semitism, but mostly just the ability even to write about people in your own community. The teaser you can give to an almana that somebody should know about her husband. Somebody who I was embarrassed to talk to in shul because he was so makpid about every moment. I never wanted to bother him to take away. No one ever heard of him, but he's a model that, he's a model. The ability to hold up people and say, look at how much greatness there is here and how much we have to look around for it, how much, if we open up our eyes, we will see, be inspired, learn from, lift ourselves up. I just love this book, and I've read it about 5 times, besides writing the pieces years ago in many cases. The ones on the Gedolim are, there's a beautiful piece on Rav Gusman, I know the Manchester Rosh Hashiva, sometimes on Askanim, on Zev Wolfson, but it's a compilation. It's 600 pages long, and I think it just gives you a very big, broad perspective on the film world and on our attitudes towards the outside, and that we can discuss people even outside of our ambit with some degree of sophistication. So, I I just love it. It's the last the greatest graphic designer in the film world was a guy named Ben Gaslin, who just retired. This is his last cover. And Baruch Hashem, we got Haskamas. I think it's probably the only Frum written book for most of the readers will be Frum, which takes its flat copy from George Eliot's Middlemarch, and we have a nice Haskama from Rav Aaron Lopiansky with Hashem. So I don't know. It's very exciting to me, and it's the only time that I've ever put something together all by myself, even though somebody else really approached me with it and it's selected about 60, 70 columns. They have 100 people that you've written about. I'm into people. I've been a biographer for most of this time. I've written 11 or 12 biographies. So that here was a chance to write about people who not everybody had ever even heard of. And anyhow, I think I haven't talked to anybody who has not been inspired by it. But, I went with a little publisher, and it was an art scroll, and it didn't command all the shelf space. So I'd surely like to see it to get into more hands than it has so far. One of the ideas, by the way, is a more production that as a reward for those who complete the Maimonides learning and so forth. So anyhow, just be prepared.
Okay. Where can people find the book?
Well, you can find it online at Feldheim. I think it's probably in most large city Jewish bookstores, but online through Feldheim is probably the easiest way. Amazon too, but might as well go through Feldheim and get it that way.
Fantastic. We'll link to that in the show notes. Jonathan Rosenblum, thank you so much for sharing your thoughts on Chareidi Media today, and may you continue writing till 80 and well beyond.
I'm ready. Thank you very much. All right, thank you for having me. It's a real pleasure.